right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So I am so excited today to be convening this celebratory event for the Olajos Goslow Endowed Chair in Conservation Science. So I feel like this event has been a long time coming for me. One of the very first meetings I had when I began as the Dean of the College of the Environment, Forestry, and Natural Sciences was actually with Tom Sisk. And it was such a bittersweet meeting because Tom came in to tell me he was retiring. And I thought, well, welcome to being the Dean. But he laid out this just incredible opportunity, which was that he had been the occupant of the Olajos Goslow Endowed Chair position since 2011 at his time at NAU. And in that, I'll talk a little bit, he'd been able to accomplish some amazing things. And part of his vision for ending his time at NAU was to make sure that the endowed chair transitioned successfully to a new holder. And basically, Tom came to me and charged me with, this is something that we can do together. And I have to tell you, it's been just such a rewarding experience to get to know Tom, but also to see this position transition to a new holder today. So really, what we're here to do today is to celebrate this endowed chair position as an entity. It's been incredibly impactful. And what's so exciting is to see the way that it's going to shape the future. NAU is already a better place because of the Olajos Goslow Chair. And today we're going to hear from the next holder, Dr. Duan Biggs, who's going to describe to us a bit of his vision as we move forward in time. So I just spoke a lot without really introducing myself or telling you, what are we doing here today. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jason Wilder. I'm the Dean of the College of the Environment, Forestry, and Natural Sciences, and also the Vice President for Research at NAU. And so soon I'll only be the Vice President for Research. Here in attendance, we've got a couple of people I just want to introduce specially as we begin, because you'll hear from a couple of them. But I want to say thank you to folks who've joined us and also just to point some folks out. So I'm going to start with Tom Sisk, who's first in my line of vision here. You'll hear from Tom. So Tom is who I just described as the former holder of the Olajos Goslow Chair. He's kind enough to come back to Flagstaff today and give us some remarks. I'd also like to introduce Marcy Olajos, whose generous donation. Her donation is what made the endowed chair possible. And I'll introduce Duan again in a minute, but I'm going to jump over Duan. I also want to recognize Ted Goslow. So Ted is here, and Ted he's a retired biology professor, and the naming of the chair honors his impactful role on Marcy's career as a student here at NAU. And I just have to share in my wanderings around Flagstaff, and especially encounters with people who love the natural world, I hear about Ted Goslow so often, and so I know you've been incredibly impactful on our alumni and students over the years. And I only got to meet Ted for the first time today, so that's been a wonderful benefit of this as well. So today, just a quick preview of events. I promise I'll stop talking eventually. But first, you'll hear from me with some welcoming remarks. And then we're going to turn it over to Tom, actually, and Tom's going to describe a little bit about the way the chair impacted his career and the accomplishments that he was able to make as a result of holding this chair. Then we'll hear from Dr. Biggs, and I'll introduce Dr. Duan Biggs a little bit more, but he's our recent hire who now holds the Olajos Goslow Chair. And really, the meat of what we want to accomplish today is to hear from Dr. Biggs a bit about his vision for the future and what the chair will allow to happen here at NAU, throughout the Southwest, and really throughout the world in terms of advancing conservation science. At the end of the hour, we'll hear a bit from Marcy too. Marcy's offered to speak with us about her vision and what the chair has meant to her. After this set of talks, we'll have a few minutes for questions and conversation, but I also hope that you'll join us afterwards in the lobby area. We'll have some reception, snacks, and drinks. And President Cruz Rivera, who was not able to join us at this moment in time, he is planning on coming around 5:15 this evening, and would love to see and meet and greet folks who are here, and also intends to just say a couple words of thanks to those who are here. So if you're at all able, please join us after those events. So a couple more words of introduction before I turn it over to others. I just want to give a little history briefly. The Olajos Goslow Chair was established in 2011, and as I said, through a generous gift from Marcy. And the mission of the chair, I want to lay this out to begin with because I think it's important context for everything we're going to hear as we move forward, is that the chair would strengthen NAU's stature as a prominent institution in the field of environmental science and policy, and specifically within the realm of conservation biology, right? And so the mission of an endowed chair is so important because it provides a level of support that is enduring in perpetuity. And so we can see this focus on conservation science building on strengths that have been here at NAU for many, many years, but really helping to focus and enable those efforts in a particularly powerful way. We're 11 years now since the establishment of the endowed chair position, and we've successfully transitioned it from the inaugural holder, Dr. Sisk, to Dr. Biggs. And so really that's the motivation to celebrate at this point. Having an endowed chair position where we've had such impacts from the incumbent in the position, and then being able to see what the future looks like. It's an important time for reflection, and also an important time to set goals for the future in terms of where our vision might take us. I'm excited to hear a little bit from Tom today. Tom can tell us a bit about how the Olajos Goslow Chair helped to empower relationship building at NAU, and specifically relationships with NGOs, with private partners, with landowners, with federal agencies. All of these kinds of relationships we know are so important in terms of advancing a conservation agenda. Tom also was incredibly impactful in enabling conservation science as an interdisciplinary science. He helped build bridges across this campus, and that interdisciplinary science where we have conservation, biology, and practice meeting with policy practice, that results in actual on-the-ground advancements that I think are so important. Tom recently shared with me the results of his work on the Cuenca Los Osos project, which is an enormous conservation project that set aside and preserved land on the border between Arizona and Mexico, and I believe on both sides of the border. Just an incredibly impressive result and the kind of thing that comes from that chair. In his time at NAU, Tom also founded the Landscape Conservation Initiative. And I think many of those in this room have ties to LCI as an organization at NAU. And one of the things that it did that continues to be impactful is it brought talent to NAU, recruited faculty and students who trained here, and faculty who we still have here on our staff, who continue to advance that mission. So Tom's impact is not just through his own work, but through the work of others around us. So then, of course, I want to talk a little bit briefly about Dr. Biggs. So Dr. Biggs, as I said, was the result of this search that we did after Tom came and told me he was retiring. We led an international search. Among the things I've gotten to do as dean, I think this search was one of the most fun things. I see Alark nodding. Alark was on the search committee. In particular, reaching out to people's letters of, or not letters, but their references, their personal references. We had Skype meetings with people all around the world engaged in conservation science at incredibly high levels. And through that process, we identified Dr. Biggs as just a standout candidate, not only for what he brought in terms of his perspective on conservation issues that we could apply to the Southwest, but because of the way he has a background in international conservation issues. And his approach has typically been very community engaged. It has been focused throughout sub-Saharan Africa and in locations in Latin America. And we're just so excited to see what Dr. Biggs will bring here to NAU, how he can inform important conservation and policy decisions and management discussions here in the Southwest, but also what he can do for our NAU community in terms of training students, bringing on new talent to the university, helping us to recruit new faculty who share interests in this interdisciplinary approach to conservation. So I'm excited to hear from Duan today. And then, of course, finally, we'll hear from Marcy, and I'm so excited. Marcy's been a wonderful partner throughout this, and just a joy to get to know, and such a steadfast supporter of NAU in so many ways. And so thank you especially to Marcy for everything. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you again all for joining us. Don't forget afterwards to please join us for the reception. We do hope to have the president there, and I'm going to turn it over to Tom to speak next.
Thanks, Jason. That was kind and a little embarrassing, but I appreciate it in part because it covered a lot of ground. And I just had a few things to say. Really, I was talking to Duan, who I just met for the first time a few days ago. I felt like I knew him because we've been on so many calls and Skypes and WhatsApp conversations to try to help him dovetail, with the NAU community when he arrived, which I think he's done pretty darn well. And he asked if I would say a few things, and I said, well, what would you want me to say? And he said, talk a little bit about the successes of your time here and where that might lead in the future. And my first reaction really was that it's hard to talk about successes when you're talking about biodiversity conservation and protecting large landscapes and the people who nurture and protect them, because those things are all in rapid decline. And when I look back to when I took this chair, the hope that society would have changed course, by 10 years down the road was really high. And it's difficult to say anything particularly optimistic and to say, well, how can we deem ourselves successful? And as is often the case in conversation with people who are really plugged into conservation and connected, they kind of called me on the carpet. And they said, yeah, that's the media. That's the messaging we get, that the world's going to hell, and it always has been. And the problems are so big and so brutal that there's nothing we can do about it. And that's where we are, a polarized world where everybody's looking for a bigger wedge and a bigger hammer to hit it with. And it's a system that's designed to disempower, to make us feel that we're too small to do anything important. And then we don't. We don't try as hard. We don't dedicate our lives to it, and we give up. Too many of us do. And there's a lot of positive out there. Jason was talking about our work on the border, and I had the good luck to be down there with Marcy and Duan and Ron Pulliam and Valere Clark and other real heroes of mine for the last few days. And it was really uplifting. And meeting with Kieran Suckling yesterday with Marcy and Duan and Tucson, conflict, yes, but hope and commitment, yes, that too. And so, there's a lot of positives. And so then the successes, of the last 10, 15, my 25 years at NAU, really pretty evident. And, one thing that the chair has allowed is it's allowed the research to advance in different ways because we could take more risks. We didn't just have to get the next grant to do slightly different version of the same thing and publish 5 more papers that were just a slight new tweak on the thing that we published the last 5. We could take risks and fail and do new things. And so the research part of it is big, and I think the main thing I'd say in 1 minute is to really explore what it meant to think of landscapes from a scientific perspective, to develop the tools to sample landscapes, to analyze and to model and to project future landscape scenarios, and that's been really powerful. Another thing is to really reach out, as Jason said, and really convene processes and bring in social design to say, how do you get people who are arguing to the table and hear what they have to say and get them involved in the analysis before you get involved in the negotiation, so that by the time you get through the negotiation, everybody's fingerprints are all over it. And while you might not reach a consensus, most of the time you can reach a consensus on what to do next. And that incremental progress is meaningful, in part because people realize that they can work with people who are different from themselves. And I think that's super important on the Colorado Plateau. I've always felt so lucky to live here. I was born in New Mexico, spent most of my life, within a half day's drive. And I feel like I know the places and the people, and to see even small progress, is really empowering. Educationally, Ted's been an inspiration. Mostly to me, we haven't spent tons of time together. It's always been fun when we have, but because of people I've run into, like Jason, who remember him and who he really had an impact on his life. And those landscapes, the chair allowed me to get students out there a lot more than would have otherwise been the case. Field trips, field classes, projects, where they get out of the classroom and they're actually doing work in conservation that makes a difference right then. And those experiences are what NAU has more than any other university. It's right out our door, but we don't have the state funding to do it. We need private money and foundation money to help us get our students out there. And I can tell you that our graduates are still out there working. They're professionals, and whenever I get out there and start working on a project now, I see my students who I haven't talked to for a long time, and they're working for the Nature Conservancy or the State Forester's Office in New Mexico, or for the Navajo Nation, or, and they are talking to each other, even if they're not talking to me. And they're networking, and they have a lot of power because of that. So, those are ways that the chair has made a huge difference. It's money, for sure, and that money allows that experimentation and the risk-taking. But it's also the networking that comes from getting people outside and bringing the science and the social design and process out into the world and engaging people, building relationships and helping people connect with each other. So, the progress, it's easy to get discouraged. But the people I've met, the people that have springboarded, I guess, from the opportunity that Marcy and Ted and many of you created, it's enough to keep us going. The last thing I'd say, I guess, is the biggest gift really is that it's forever. 10 years. Marcy said, I'm going to make this gift, but I want you to commit 5 years to getting it started. Well, it's been 10, and it's been great. But the most important thing is that there's another person, and there'll be another one after that, and another one after that. And so this stream of resources will always be there. There'll always be a committed person trying to figure out how to use them to the best degree. And it's pretty cool, actually. I think, my background, is pretty deeply rooted here. I have pictures of my grandfather crossing Lee's Ferry, before there was a bridge, and other things like that. I've felt invested from day one, and that's helped me a lot. But it's also held me back a lot, because there are barriers for people, when you're working in a place where you have that history. There's a lot of advantages, there are a few disadvantages. And I think it's pretty interesting that Duan's coming in here, and he's kind of coming from an opposite space, where he's been very engaged and very effective on 3 or 4 continents, but not this one. And he's bringing all those lessons in large landscape conservation, in wildlife, and most importantly, working in communities, in diverse places, and bringing people together and being committed to students. So I think it's a really bright next 10 years, maybe 15, but once you get there, you should be thinking maybe it's time to bring somebody else along. So thanks, Marcy and Ted and Jason, but really I look out at that audience and it's a really amazing team out there. And I know there's several times this many that, couldn't make it. So look in the mirror, there's a lot of positivity. So thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Biggs, who will tell us a bit about his vision for the chair for the next 10 to 15 years. Yeah.
Thank you. We're doing the lights for those on Zoom. I have a colleague currently in Uganda who's done films on lions for National Geographic, and he's helping us with the video we're making for this so that it can be online. And maybe on that note, Dr. David Western, who helped establish Wildlife Conservation Society's international program for conservation a few decades ago, will be here as our first, well, if we want to say post-pandemic, Olajos Goslow speaker, and he'll be speaking on Friday. And a lot of people in East Africa, where he's based in Kenya, have also asked to see a recording of his lecture, so that'll be happening then. And it'll be great to see some of you there as well. So thank you, Jason, for the introductions, and Tom for those kind words. And I'm not going to talk about my vision for 15 years, because I don't think I've been here long enough to understand how that should best look. And but I'm very happy to be here. I feel very privileged, and I do feel very honored, and also a great sense of responsibility to follow on from your work, Tom. Is that working? Right, yes, good. And to build on what you've done and bring my international experiences and perspectives into this landscape, building on the very the deep local knowledge that you brought to the position. So I was thinking when I was preparing the lecture that, I was thinking, well, what are my research themes? What are the concepts? How does this apply? Having some conceptual diagrams. And I was chatting to Marcy and Tom on the weekend on the border, and Marcy pointed out, Duan, that might be a little boring for the audience. And they might be more interested in hearing about, where you come from, what your experiences have been. And therefore, because that informs what you will be doing here, and then stemming from that, what your initial visions are at this early stage, and then what you see at this point, your contribution to the NAU community. So that's where I'll start, and then towards the end of my talk, I will get onto my vision, or how I see what I've been doing to date, especially over the past few years, really connecting well to some of the challenges on the Colorado Plateau and the Southwest, and be talking about some of those linkages I see and opportunities I see for students and engaging NAU staff on some of the projects and programs I'm working on. So this is the part of the world I'm from. How many of you have been in this part of the world? Could you raise your hand, please? About 10%, it seems. Namibia, the country in green, and South Africa in orange, and very fortunate to grow up there with animals like these, giraffe, leopard, zebra, etc. And so going back as well, in line with what Marcy suggested, I grew up around Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia, and this is a slightly younger version of myself on the left-hand side. Pardon? Only slightly of this photo. And some of you may think, well, where is that? That looks like the landscape around here. And it does. It's very similar. So I feel a very sort of, although it's a different country and it is a different place, I do feel a sense of homecoming being here in this arid savanna landscape. And so at the time I was growing up there, my parents were veterinarians for the government, spent a lot of time on farms, and were also studying birds of prey. So I spent a lot of time on what we call farms, or livestock farms, cattle farms, ranches. And these were ranches, and we spent a lot of time with them and studying birds of prey on their land. And so I do feel an affinity to this landscape because they were settled by European settlers at around about the same time. And so there's a lot of similarities. So then when in 1991, my father and then later my mother got a position with South African National Park Scientific Services. So I moved over to South Africa's Kruger National Park and was lucky to live with animals like these. And very, very dynamic and fast-changing times in South Africa. Then in 1994, when I started high school, that was when Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president. And so the challenges that South Africa faced at that time and still faces in many ways today were really key to my approach to life and also my approach to conservation in terms of nature and conservation is something that can bring people together, even in a very divided society. Yes, in South Africa, as here, there's some real challenges around a history of oppression and division and inequities that can also, in many ways, not always, but in many ways, we can do conservation in a way that addresses those. And I certainly see an opportunity to bring that perspective and those insights to this region. So one of the ways I did this when I was just out of high school while I was studying undergraduate, I set up projects with some of the NGOs on the slide, BirdLife, Conservation International, Endangered Wildlife Trust, and really looking at working in the communities that really suffered from the system of apartheid and trying to, therefore, very poor schooling opportunities and not very many prospects for developing themselves and flourishing as individuals, to create projects that select some of these individuals and give them the opportunity to spend time in nature and train and mentor them to become local birdwatching guides, ecotourism guides, earn a better income, and also contribute to conservation. So I was doing that for a number of years and also studied those projects for my master's degree, which I did at the University of Cape Town. And based on that, I was given the opportunity to, that's Brandon Hayes, helped us set up all the IT. Thank you, Brandon. I hope you're not that bored. But so was then given the opportunity to go and apply those social ecological systems lens to the coral reef tourism system on Australia's Great Barrier Reef and in Thailand. And so one of the most interesting findings from my PhD work, and that sort of made sense to me, but no one had really demonstrated this in the literature before, was that in the same way as the long-tail boat, as they called in Thailand, a subsistence fisherman, this is his or her or their little boat here in the foreground, and a commercial reef tourism operator's boat in the background. And so when I started my work there in Thailand, I spoke to our partners at Chulalongkorn University and said, well, we should also, in addition to surveying the commercial operators, we should survey these communal operators, these small-scale operators. I said, well, why would you want to do that? We know why they do it. They see there's an opportunity for money, and there's not that much fish that season. So that's why they do it. So I said, well, let's ask them. Let's hear their perspectives. And so we did that, and what we found was that in the same way as individuals that are active in running companies and taking boats out to reefs, that are working in the commercial sector, some of you that have been out to Australia's Great Barrier Reef would have been on, those are often motivated by, or highly motivated by lifestyle values, and in the same way the small-scale operators are. And so they are enjoying being out on the ocean. So if they could get a job that gives them 3 times as much money working in a factory in town, they're probably not going to take it because they want to be out on the ocean. And part of that is sharing the experience of the ocean, the marine life with people, and also feeling that they're contributing to conservation. So after my PhD, I returned back to South Africa to work for Scientific Services of South Africa National Parks. I was traveling around the region at the time, and those of you who have been there over time would also be able to remark on this radical change in land use. And so those ranches I used to spend time on as a young child, they and those, often the same individuals or the next generation of people on that land had switched from livestock and cattle as a form of land use to conservation. And so you can see it in the contrast of these two images, what the extent of expansion of conservation lands of different sorts, either on communal land or on private land, has been. And talking to some of these ranches and the people on these lands, it was really remarkable to see to what extent they were also now, their culture had in a sense shifted, whereas 30 years prior in the 1970s or 80s, they may have said, well, we don't want martial eagles or predators on our land. They're going to hammer our livestock. We don't like that idea at all. Get rid of them. Let's shoot them. And now it was, well, do you know what we saw yesterday flying over? It might be building a nest, a martial eagle, or a cheetah just crossed, and we're really happy about this. And it's, yes, the growth in tourism in Southern Africa in the 1990s and 2000s really provided a revenue stream for this, but it wasn't only that. It was also a cultural change and a transformation in the way people related to land. And so we were discussing, Tom, over the past few days, I'm looking at these landscapes, I'm like, well, they are so similar to what I've seen. They kind of, and in terms of land use, they look quite like what I grew up in, mainly cattle dominated. But that doesn't mean they can't change, and we've got good examples of elsewhere in the world where the same sorts of people have transformed, and maybe it's possible. And my thoughts were met with some skepticism, but I do think it's not impossible, and we can work towards that. And understanding people's connection to land and what's important to their lifestyles is part of that. And here's just a figure of numbers. You can see cattle and small stock, and cattle really reducing over time, and livestock and wildlife picking up. And it's really good to also see how different landholders come together to create large conservancies, where they're conserving not only individual portions of land, but large agglomerated portions of land. So as I was saying, I actually didn't go back to Southern Africa to work with those ranches. I worked with national parks and looked at developing a tourism research framework. As many of you, some of you may know, but many of you may not be familiar with this. they raise in excess of 80% of their own income through tourism that they get to keep in their own coffers. So which is quite different from most protected area authorities globally. And so South African national parks at the time had a very strong scientific services and a strong connection to management and policy, but not for tourism research. And so my job was to, well, this is obviously driving decision making, such an important source of revenue. Let's be structured and scientific about how we integrate it into our planning overall. So we were making good progress on that and getting good meetings and buy-in from park managers and the executive. But that was also the time when the rhino poaching crisis was really taking off in South Africa. And so I realized that whatever we're doing in integrating tourism or whatever else anyone is doing really doesn't matter that much at this point in time, because everyone's attention and all resources are going to how we fight the war on the rhino poachers and how we deal with this poaching crisis. And I felt, well, this is an area that really needs some engagement and application of thought and research to. And that's when I started getting engaged and really thinking, well, we've got such a violent history in South Africa and Southern Africa. And so really let's not just fall into the trap again of that, and let's try and think about how we could perhaps do this differently and not just create rhino wars. And so I was really focused on a community-based response and a rights-based response to illegal wildlife trade, and that through publications like this, engaging with a lot of the international NGOs and working closely with the IUCN, I managed to have opportunities to be involved in illegal wildlife or wildlife trade initiatives from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, etc. So that was really good experience and exposure. And many of the projects and initiatives I started developing during that time and over the past few years are what I'm still working on now and I see connection to in terms of not so much the wildlife trade part, but how we get communities and people on the land to be on site for conservation and what are the approaches for that. And so I'll talk a little bit about that now. And one of the key issues that emerged in that work is the challenge of human-wildlife conflict. So if you are, as this photo was taken in northern Namibia, if those are your cows and they want to go and drink water in an arid landscape and there's the elephant chasing them away, you're not going to be very happy with the elephant. And you're probably going, if someone comes along and says, hey, you know what, I've got a good deal on ivory, where's the elephant? You may well be incentivized, especially if you're not getting any benefit from the elephant at all. You'll probably feel, oh, this isn't too bad. I'll get some money and this annoying elephant will be gone. And so this is a real challenge in the space. So related to that, one of the initiatives I'm moving forward on now is led by a good colleague of mine and supported strongly by Conservation International and the Peace Parks Foundation, which is South Africa based. And it's really focused on, it starts with rangelands, and it's about restoration of rangelands and achieving inclusive conservation through the entry point of communities and their livestock. So the principle is, rather than as NGOs and international agencies often do in places like Southern or East Africa, come in and be, all right, time to change your land use, no more cows, let's do this, and you must stop doing that, but without really hearing the local perspectives. And if livestock's been part of their culture and history for decades, maybe centuries, that's something that, that's an entry point to start working with. So this initiative starts with that, and they pulled me in to see, well, what are the linkages with tackling illegal wildlife trade? And this initiative moved forward, or has moved forward a lot and developed and expanded, but they've not done too much work on, well, what are the social impacts? What are the conservation impacts? How does this change attitudes towards conservation? And so we're developing a PhD that will be advertised soon, and we're looking for further funding to expand this program and the insights that we get from, well, taking a livestock-based approach to achieving conservation certainly, I think, has relevance here and could be applied over time. The other exciting initiative that came from this, working with the United Nations, was that, and this especially became paramount during the pandemic when there was a collapse in tourism, was the need for alternative revenue streams to people that are around places of conservation concern. And so in Central Africa, West Africa, people coming to see gorillas. Well, if there's no tourists, these people are not benefiting. So what do we do? So with the digital innovations we have, well, maybe there's a way in which, it's amazing how many people in countries like Uganda all have it might be a basic smartphone, but it's still a smartphone. They could have an app. They could go out and monitor things. There's the global community in countries based in countries such as this one, the United Kingdom, that would, want to fund conservation. Let's see how we can connect these. What are the mechanisms by which we can do this? So working with the United Nations and the Great Ape Survival Partnership on that. And certainly an important part of that as well is that it's a part of citizen science. And our thinking there is, well, and the literature does indicate this, people buy into conservation and are willing to really support it, as I was mentioning about lifestyle benefits earlier. Money helps. Money is always important. But it's deeper than that. It's a sense of community, a sense of what I'm doing is important. And so we want to try and see, well, initiatives such as this, can they actually contribute to building a sense of community for conservation around these areas? And that obviously has very wide applicability. The other level I got involved in through my work on the wildlife trade was through CITES, the Convention of Trade in Endangered Species, and attended forums such as this one. This is the COP in 2016 in Johannesburg. And I was participating in these meetings and really felt very frustrated because there was, we're supposedly a science-based convention, but they weren't really talking science. It was more theatrics. And I sort of sensed, well, they're arguing, and elephants really dominated a lot of the discussion because people like elephants. And should you hunt elephants? Should you sell ivory, or should you not? What does the science say? And actually, I sort of felt, well, there's a lot of science on that, but it's being twisted and turned to suit whichever side different stakeholders may be on. And what's actually at the heart of this matter is different values. Is it okay to hunt an elephant? Is it okay to sell its ivory? Or do elephants have the same rights as humans? And unless we develop a process to bring those different moral perspectives into how we deciding on policies on elephants, we're not going to be able to move forward. We're just going to be stuck in this stagnant quagmire. And so this paper sort of summarized that insight from a few years ago. And I really, when this was published in Science a few years ago, I really tried to push with CITES, the CITES Secretariat, with the IUCN, well, let's try this process. It's clearly what's happening now is not working. And there wasn't that much interest in it, so I took the idea elsewhere and developed other initiatives. And one of them that stemmed from that was this development of what we call a standard for human-wildlife coexistence. And that's focused on seeing that the challenge of human-wildlife conflict and achieving human-wildlife coexistence is so widespread around the world. And there's all these different approaches, and funders of conservation want to know that good processes are in place, good governance is happening. How do we do this? And a standard can help for that. It's independently evaluated and verified. Also, it can guide investment, even for things like citizen science I mentioned earlier. If someone says, I want to pay individuals directly, well, say, pay individuals in these areas. We know they're well managed. And we align with respect for human rights. And so emerging from these discussions, this is some images from workshops at a community level and at a national level in Namibia, where we were discussing some of the approaches to doing this. This is an international level workshop, which we had to do on Zoom, as we all had to do during the pandemic. But what emerged from that was really working closely with the IUCN's Green List, and they're really interested in integrating this into their approach. Now, the Green List within the IUCN sits within the World Commission on Protected Areas, and they're really key to the drive to achieve 30 by 30, 30% of land conserved by 2030. And what they're arguing is that, well, we don't just want more paper parks. We don't want pieces of land that countries commit to but actually nothing's happening on the ground. We want to know there's good conservation happening and there's good management practice. And the Green List does that. And it's standard, it's independently verified. And they want to integrate this the human-wildlife coexistence part to the standard where it's relevant, which is relevant in many parts of Southern Africa where I work. From our discussions over the past few days, certainly would be relevant on the borderlands region, especially if we want to look at supporting the reintroduction of species such as jaguar. And so I think there's a real opportunity here. The other thing that this links to is the other effective conservation measures, the OECMs. So what the World Commission on Protected Areas is saying, and the Green List is, look, we need to move beyond the notion that we're going to protect these things through government declarations and government protected areas. There's so much land out there already that people in communities or private landholders or public land that are effectively being managed for conservation and maybe with a few tweaks could be properly managed for conservation. And this is a system, and it would feed into the standard to achieve that. So I see real opportunities there to use or to apply the thinking and that process to achieving 30 by 30, including, as I understand, in the current administration, there's a strong drive to achieve it here under the banner of America the Beautiful. And you'll see Credit Suisse up there as a logo, and you might be wondering, well, why is Credit Suisse up there? And that is part of the applying an innovative approach to this, is that we're looking at, and I'll be in workshops later this month on developing a bond. So it's actually an endowment for getting sites up to Green List level. How would that be monitored and evaluated, and then a stream of funding to fund that into the future. And this is growing, and I think this is really exciting. And from, again, what I understood from the past few days, something like that could actually be very valuable in some of those lands, especially on the Mexican side. So, and then lastly, and I see I should start wrapping up, after I'd sort of thought, well, this CITES secretariat and high-level dialogues on ivory and elephants, they're not going to want to do this process. It will just continue stagnating along. They contacted me last month, the African Elephant Specialist Group, and said, look, we'd really like to do this now. Things are stuck. African governments are asking for this. So I thought, well, look, it's hard, but let's try. And so I'm looking to bring in some conflict mediators, facilitators, and some of the lessons learned from negotiating the end to armed conflicts, because this is a serious conflict. It's not at the point of being fully armed yet, but it's got a lot of those attributes. And so looking to develop that process. And then in my time in southern Utah last month and talking to people around the restoration of the monuments there, Grand Staircase, Escalante, and Bears Ears, I thought, well, jeepers. Elephants are polarized and difficult to move forward on, but the restoration of these monuments equally so. So I would potentially see, and I'm in dialogue with some of the groups there, including the BLM, the Escalante partners, to see, well, maybe where's the opportunity to bring some of these insights from managing these conflict that has in essence some of the same issues, different values, different ideas of what represents conservation to this region. Right, so moving on from some examples of specific initiatives, I'd certainly, as Tom mentioned, really want to use the opportunity of this chair to build and strengthen collaborations across NAU. So I see many, I've met many great researchers here, there's lots of great work happening, but from the little bit I've seen so far, I see great potential for connections. And so Alark sitting there and I have been discussing, well, how could SES and forestry link better on some of these transdisciplinary issues? And he suggested the idea of a mountain institute, which we thought we could start with some transdisciplinary events involving some external NAU speakers and really some opportunities focused on early career researchers. And I've spoken to Bruce Hungate about that as well, and he's supportive of it too. So that's something that we'll start to look to do next semester. I've also been in discussion with SIX, and they're doing some amazing work using new satellite technologies and innovations to monitor what's happening to forest elephants and what's happening to their habitat. And I certainly see potential and opportunities there to link with the bottom-up, community-oriented, inclusive conservation approach. So we're in discussions to explore those further. Also, to further enrich the NAU student experience, I've been in discussions with the Organization for Tropical Studies, Kakuza Science Leadership Initiative, and also with Taylor Joyal here in SES. And we're looking to get some capstone opportunities up for students to gain that unique experience in Kruger National Park as part of their capstone, starting this summer. And also these various groups some of which I've mentioned before, such as UN Environment, the Great Ape Survival Partnership, Wildlife Conservation Society, they've indicated, well, they're interested in working together, and internships or opportunities for students here is a good way to start that. Right, so I would just like to, at this stage, thank Hagoda, who I believe is outside still, there she is, for all her help in just getting things and the coordination involved and getting AV systems to work, and some of the other names here for all their great help in getting this event happening. And then thanks to Jason and Claire and numerous other NAU staff that have made me feel so welcome here, and feel that, wow, this is a nice place to be. And then thanks to Tom and Marcy for also being around and available to talk, giving me input on my ideas, on my thoughts on moving forward. And yeah, it's been remarkable. Thank you. And so I don't know if there are any questions or if there's time for them, or we should leave them for the end.
Let's let Marcy talk, and we'll have
Yep.
time for questions afterwards. So thank you. So thank you so much to Duan. So as I said, we'll let Marcy speak, and afterwards we'll have a couple minutes for questions and conversation, and then take it out to the lobby for refreshments.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Well, when I initially decided to create the Olajos Goslow Chair, I was confident about its purpose and the choice of Tom Sisk to lead its objectives. But I certainly didn't expect it to enhance my life the way it has. To be participatory in workshops and seminars, the Grand Canyon semester, all ways about expanding landscapes literally and figuratively for students. It all brightened my outlook for the future. Tom has made this chair a very personal experience for me. Thank you, Tom. To say the chair is expanding in scope is putting it mildly. See, African elephants and the Colorado Plateau. When I visited Namibia several years ago, it felt like I had taken peyote and traveled with Carlos Castaneda, being transported from my Sonoran Desert and the deserts of southern Utah to the deserts of Africa. Same colors, strange geographical formations. I thought, where am I? Did I just take that long plane ride and ended up in the same place? And then the large mammals began to appear, and I was pulled back to reality. I was in Africa. I've seen some fantastic rock art over the years, backpacking with friends. And in fact, last fall with Tom and others, we saw the most spectacular collection of art I have ever seen when we were backpacking in the Kanab wilderness. I've thought back to the day I experienced the rock art of Namibian ancient people. Same, but oh so different. And to hear the concerns and fears of Namibian indigenous people about their changing landscapes, disappearing water, and foreign extraction of minerals, all affecting their way of life. Same concerns as our Native American people of the Southwest deserts. Duan Biggs brings his extensive professional experiences in Africa and Australia to our Colorado Plateau. He has expansive ideas, over-the-top enthusiasm and curiosity, all of which will stretch and reshape the possibilities for the students of NAU. He too knows the importance of bringing seemingly disparate groups of people together to discuss and discover new ways of working on problems facing our desert environment. Duan, I look forward to traveling with you down this dusty road. And now I'll take this opportunity today to announce a new graduate level scholarship, the Dr. Tom Sisk Graduate Award in Conservation Science. These funds will be utilized by selected students from underrepresented groups who show interest in conservation biology. I think I can call it a passion and certainly a belief of Tom's that bringing people together to understand the threats to and the beauty of the natural world is basic to the preservation of lands and biodiversity. Tom, my dear friend, on to new adventures and possibilities. Although your view looks out onto the waters and mountains of British Columbia, you're still a desert rat. Thank you to everyone who's here today.
So I just want to extend my incredible appreciation and thanks to Marcy for what she just announced. The Tom Sisk Fellowship is going to be incredibly impactful in helping students who have passion and interest and desire to learn about conservation science. And I think everything we saw today, for me, it made me, I feel so lucky and privileged to live on the Colorado Plateau. And I feel so fortunate that we have supporters like Marcy and Tom and Ted who help train students who will be the next generation that can provide support to those students to study things. So that is so impactful. I'm so appreciative of the way that this continues to just enhance NAU in the Colorado Plateau here. So thank you to all of you for speaking. I'd like to, yes, one more round. We've got a few minutes. If there's questions, comments, discussion, happy to take it to any, and nobody wants to ask me questions. I'll move aside in a minute. Marcy or Tom or Duan, I welcome anything from that audience. Jane.
Thank you, and welcome. You're gonna love it here. I'm curious, what are some of your thoughts about including the tribes in your work?
Should I stand up there so it's
Maybe stand up.
it's captured? No, I'm very enthusiastic about doing that. I've reached out to some groups and individuals. I do understand it's also, and Tom and I were talking about it yesterday, it's quite complex and it's a nuanced landscape. So I think one of the more dangerous things I can do is to just jump in there and be, we can do this and this will work because it's worked there. And so I'm getting a good feel of the landscape and what's happening, who some of the individuals are, what are ways in which some of these the experiences I bring, the ideas I bring could potentially be helpful. And certainly already something that we've discussed with the exchange opportunity for students to South Africa's Kruger National Park. So the Organization for Tropical Studies there and Lawrence Kruger, who set that up, they've run quite a few courses with other universities in the US, bringing tribal groups, tribal students out to the Kruger National Park and having learning and exchange opportunities. And I can, that's a starting point I'm looking to move forward on, and would, within the next 6 to 12 months, try and source some funding to get that moving. But I'm, if anyone has any ideas or thoughts of connections, I'd be really interested. I think the 30 by 30 opportunity and the opportunity that certainly has provided to tribal lands and communal lands in other countries, I don't see why some of those opportunities can't be expanded to here.
I was curious about that great increase in wildlife when you reduced the amount of ranching on the landscape in Namibia, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how much of that is changing available habitat and how much of that is reducing direct take of wildlife because we're not trying to protect livestock anymore.
I think that's a very good question. I think there's a number of elements to that. So one is there in Namibian legislation, wildlife is privately owned and on your private land. So if there's wildlife on your land, if it stays on your land, it's yours. And so then, and there's hunting there, so you're allowed to sell your wildlife to hunters. If someone says, well, I like your own antelopes, I really want to buy them, you can sell them on. So there are some perverse incentives that emerge through that system, but what it means is that in an arid landscape where, cattle are marginal anyway, it means that you're like, well, I can have tourism, I can have some foreign hunters, and I can, sell on some of this wildlife to others. This makes much more sense as a land use. Plus, it's nice living with these animals and feeling I'm contributing to their persistence. So I think those drivers combine, and certainly the elephants, the increase in elephant numbers, that's been on communal land especially, that's been driven by the incentives brought by income mainly from hunting, but also tourism. And so they tolerate the elephants, and they've got, we're getting more money from having these elephants around than not having them around. So if someone wants to come and poach them, well, we're not going to tolerate that. So a combination of those sorts of factors. I think the competition between wildlife and livestock is actually really interesting, and I'm not sure to what extent it's been studied here, but there are studies that show that because of the incentives of that system, and actually farmers or landholders with wildlife can be, their incentives are, well, we want as much wildlife as we can have, and that means you're overstocking wildlife. So there's some schools of thought that it's actually some of the land condition was better under cattle than it is under wildlife. But so these are some of the tensions that emerge, and and I think also for if you're running a tourism experience, then tourists often come from Western countries. They don't necessarily like the idea that much of seeing cattle as well as wildlife. But I think that's a perception that needs to change, because you've probably all seen The Lion King. That when I was up in that part of northern Tanzania, southern Kenya. The Lion King does not have any humans in that system, in neither of the movies. But that is a human, livestock, wildlife interactive landscape. That's its history. It's been shaped that way for hundreds to thousands of years. So now, so the images we're getting, and it comes to what you said earlier, Tom, here, oh, this is so nice. No people. People have always been there. And so conservation as the idea, well, this is wildlife and no people. Well, that's actually not. That's just a figment of the European colonial imagination in some ways. We need to move back to being more pluralistic and understand that these animals can live together.
We've got time for one more question. Or we can go have snacks. Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Duan, for sharing today. Thank you all for attending. As I said, we've got some time out in the lobby if you'd like to hang out there and more informally talk with anyone here. The president should be joining us in about 15 minutes or so if you'd like to hang around. Thank you.